The small log cabin stood alone against the vast wilderness, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the crisp morning air. Inside, Rose woke before sunrise as she always did, the habit ingrained after 2 years of surviving on her own. At 16, she had grown accustomed to the weight of solitude that settled on her shoulders each morning as she kindled the fire and prepared for another day of hard work. 2 winters had passed since the fever took her parents, leaving her alone on this patch of frontier land that her father had claimed with such hope in his eyes. "This will be our new beginning," he had told her, his voice full of dreams that now echoed in the empty cabin. Rose pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to the small window, watching as the first light touched the tops of the pine trees. The nearest town was half a day's ride away, and the closest neighbor almost an hour's walk. This isolation had been her parents' choice. They wanted the freedom of the frontier, the chance to build something from nothing. Now it was her burden to bear. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved about the cabin, each sound amplified in the morning quiet. She dipped a tin cup into the water bucket and drank deeply, then splashed cold water on her face, gasping at the shock, but welcoming the clarity it brought. Her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin showed a face that had aged beyond its years. Sun-browned skin stretched over high cheekbones, eyes that held both strength and wariness. Breakfast was simple, cornmeal mush sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey from the bees she tended behind the cabin. Rose ate standing up, looking out the window at the chores awaiting her. The vegetable garden needed weeding, the chickens required feeding, and the roof of the small barn had a leak that wouldn't fix itself. "One thing at a time," she whispered to herself, her mother's favorite saying when tasks seemed overwhelming. The sound of her own voice startled her sometimes, breaking the silence that had become her constant companion. Outside, the morning air bit at her cheeks as she made her way to the chicken coop. The 5 hens clucked and fussed as she scattered feed and collected 3 brown eggs still warm in her palm. "Thank you, ladies," she said, patting the nearest hen's speckled feathers. Talking to animals had become a habit. They were better listeners than most people anyway. Rose had learned to be self-sufficient by necessity. Her father had taught her to hunt and trap before he passed, skills that raised eyebrows when the townspeople learned a young girl was putting meat on her own table. Her mother had shown her which plants could heal and which would kill, how to preserve food for winter and how to stitch wounds closed when there was no doctor to be found. The garden took up most of her morning. Kneeling in the dirt, Rose pulled weeds from between rows of beans, carrots, and potatoes. The soil was good here, rich and dark. At least her father had chosen well in that regard. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old tune her mother used to sing while making bread. The melody drifted across the clearing and into the trees, where birds occasionally answered with calls of their own. By midday, the sun beat down on her back, and sweat trickled between her shoulder blades. Rose sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand and leaving a smudge of dirt behind. In the distance, beyond the tree line, lay the river that marked the boundary of her property, and beyond that, the territories where the native tribes lived. The townspeople spoke of the natives with fear and suspicion. "Wild savages," the shopkeeper would mutter whenever news came of conflicts further west. "You're too close to their hunting grounds, girl. It ain't safe for a young woman alone." But Rose had seen members of the tribe fishing along the far bank of the river, had watched from a distance as they moved with purpose and skill through the forest. They had never bothered her, and she had been careful not to give them reason to. The invisible line of the river separated their worlds, a boundary both sides respected. After a quick meal of bread and cheese in the shade of an old oak tree, Rose headed to the barn to fix the leaking roof. The wooden ladder creaked as she climbed, hammer tucked into her belt and a pouch of nails hanging from her shoulder. The work was hard, the sun merciless on her back as she pounded nails through replacement shingles. Her hands, once soft, now bore calluses that told the story of her struggle to maintain what her parents had built. Sometimes, in moments like these, loneliness would crash over her like a wave. Rose paused, sitting back on the roof beam and looking out over the land that was both her prison and her home. In town, girls her age were learning to dance and sew fine dresses, dreaming of husbands and children. She had different dreams now, or perhaps they weren't dreams at all, just hopes for survival through another winter, another spring, another year alone. The town preacher had offered to find her a place with a family after her parents died. "A young girl needs guidance," he'd said, his voice gentle but his eyes pitying. "You can't stay out there all alone." But this land was all she had left of her family. Leaving it behind felt like abandoning them all over again. So she had straightened her back, lifted her chin, and told him she would manage just fine, thank you very much. The townspeople called her the little orphan when they thought she couldn't hear. Some admired her grit, while others shook their heads at her stubbornness. A few of the kinder women brought her seeds or cloth when she came to town for supplies she couldn't make or grow herself. The blacksmith sometimes fixed her tools for nothing more than a dozen eggs or a jar of honey. Small kindnesses that made her feel less alone, if only for a moment. As the afternoon waned, Rose climbed down from the roof, satisfied with her repair. Her muscles ached from the day's work, but there was still more to do. She collected water from the well, fed the chickens their evening meal, and checked her snares in the woods near the cabin. One had caught a rabbit, which she quickly and mercifully dispatched before carrying it home for skinning. Dinner preparation was methodical, a ritual that filled the hours as daylight faded. She worked by the warm glow of the fire and a single candle, preserving the precious tallow. The rabbit would provide meat for several days, its fur set aside for tanning later. Nothing went to waste in her world. Survival depended on using everything available. As darkness settled outside, Rose sat by the fire, mending a tear in her only other dress. The needle flashed in the firelight as she worked, her stitches small and even as her mother had taught her. In these quiet evening hours, memories of her parents felt closest, her father's deep laugh, her mother's gentle hands. Sometimes she spoke to them as if they were sitting across from her, telling them about her day, asking questions that would never be answered. "I fixed the barn roof today," she said softly to the empty room. "Pa would be proud, I think. It's holding good and strong now." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees and finding the small gaps in the cabins chinking that she hadn't yet repaired. Tomorrow she would mix more clay and straw to fill those spaces. Another task on the endless list of work that kept this place and her from falling apart. Before climbing into her narrow bed, Rose checked that the door was barred and her father's rifle was loaded and within reach. The frontier held dangers both human and animal, and she had learned to sleep lightly, one ear always alert for unusual sounds in the night. She blew out the candle and lay in darkness, pulling the quilt her mother had made up to her chin. Through the small window, stars punctured the black velvet of the sky, countless and cold. Rose watched them until her eyes grew heavy, wondering if anyone else was looking at the same stars and feeling as small and alone as she did. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. Endless work, quiet meals, the company of chickens and memories, but there was comfort in routine, in the knowledge that she was managing, surviving, keeping her parents' dream alive in this wild place they had chosen to call home. The misty morning arrived with a chill that seeped through the cabin walls. Rose woke earlier than usual, disturbed by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her uneasy. She built up the fire, watching the flames catch and grow as her mind wandered to the day ahead. The water barrel was running low. A trip to the river would be necessary. After a quick breakfast of cornbread and the last of yesterday's rabbit stew, Rose gathered her things. She took 2 wooden buckets, tied them to the ends of a carrying yoke, and slung her father's old hunting knife at her hip. Not that she expected trouble, but the wilderness had taught her caution. As an afterthought, she grabbed a small sack of dried berries, tucking them into her pocket for a mid-morning snack. The path to the river was well worn from her daily trips. Rose walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, where roots might trip unwary feet, which bramble patches to avoid, and where the best blackberry bushes would bear fruit come summer. Birds called overhead, and occasionally a squirrel would scamper across her path, busy with its own morning tasks. The river came into view as she rounded the last bend in the trail. The water ran clear and swift, swollen from recent rains upstream. This river was her lifeline, providing water for drinking, cooking, and washing, but it was also a boundary. Everyone knew the far bank belonged to the native tribe, though Rose had only caught glimpses of them from a distance. As she approached the water's edge, something unusual caught her eye. A movement on the opposite bank, too deliberate to be an animal. Rose paused, setting down her buckets and narrowing her eyes against the morning sun that glinted off the water. Through the rising mist she could make out a figure, small and hunched, moving slowly along the riverbank. It was a girl younger than herself. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with beaded patterns, her dark hair falling in 2 long braids. But what drew Rose's attention was the way she moved. Each step seemed painful as she dragged her right leg behind her. The girl was heading toward the river's narrowest point, where crossing was possible but still dangerous with the current running strong from the spring melt. Rose stood frozen, uncertain what to do. The townspeople's warnings echoed in her mind. Stay clear of the natives, they're unpredictable, dangerous. Yet before her was just a child, clearly injured and struggling. The native girl hadn't noticed Rose yet. She reached the water's edge and tested it with one foot, wincing as the cold current rushed around her ankle. She took another step, then another, the water rising to her knees. But as she tried to put weight on her injured leg, she stumbled, nearly falling into the rushing water. Rose didn't remember making the decision to move. One moment she was watching, the next she was splashing into the river, the icy water stealing her breath. "Wait!" she called out, though she knew the girl probably wouldn't understand her words. "Let me help you." The native girl's head snapped up, her dark eyes widening with fear. She tried to back away but grimaced in pain when her injured leg buckled beneath her. "It's okay," Rose said, keeping her voice gentle as she would when approaching a frightened animal. She held up empty hands to show she carried no weapon. "I won't hurt you." The current pushed against Rose's legs as she waded deeper, careful of the slippery stones beneath her feet. The water reached her thighs, soaking her dress, but she hardly noticed the cold now. She was focused entirely on reaching the girl, who watched her approach with a mixture of fear and desperation. When Rose was within arm's length, she stopped, not wanting to frighten the girl more. Up close, she could see that the girl was perhaps 12 or 13, her face drawn with pain, a nasty gash visible on her right calf, crudely wrapped with a strip of cloth that had come loose in the water. Rose pointed to the girl's leg, then to herself, then made a lifting motion with her arms. She repeated the gestures slowly, trying to communicate her intention to help. The girl's eyes darted between Rose's face and the far bank, calculating her limited options. A tense moment passed before the girl gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Permission granted, Rose moved closer. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Rose." Then she pointed questioningly at the girl. The girl hesitated before responding softly, "Kimi." Rose smiled, encouraged by this small exchange. "Kimi," she repeated, earning another nod. With careful movements, Rose positioned herself next to Kimi and indicated she would carry her across. The girl was light in her arms, too light, and Rose could feel her trembling from cold, pain, or fear. Perhaps all three. She stepped carefully across the riverbed, feeling for secure footing with each step, conscious of the precious burden she carried. The current tugged more strongly at the deepest part, nearly pulling them both under. Rose gritted her teeth and pushed forward, her muscles burning with the effort. Kimi clung to her, small fingers digging into Rose's shoulders. When they finally reached the shallows on Rose's side of the river, both girls were breathing hard. Rose set Kimi down gently on a fallen log and knelt to examine her leg. The gash was deep and angry-looking, the edges beginning to show signs of infection. Rose frowned, thinking of her mother's lessons on healing herbs and poultices. Kimi watched warily as Rose untied the kerchief from around her neck and soaked it in the river. With gentle hands, Rose cleaned away the dirt from around the wound, apologizing softly when Kimi flinched. From her pocket, she took out the small sack of dried berries and offered some to the girl, who accepted them hesitantly. As they sat together on the riverbank, an uncertain silence between them, Rose tried to puzzle out how Kimi had come to be alone and injured. She pointed questioningly at the far bank, then at Kimi, raising her eyebrows in silent question. Kimi seemed to understand. She made a series of gestures, gathering plants, a fall being separated from others. Rose nodded, piecing together the story. Gathering medicine plants, perhaps? A fall down a ravine, then unable to find her way back with an injured leg? Rose's heart ached for the girl. Despite the differences between them, language, culture, the invisible boundary of the river, she saw in Kimi the same determination that had kept her going after losing her parents. They were both survivors. The morning sun had burned away the mist now, and Rose knew decisions needed to be made. Kimi's wound required proper cleaning and herbs to draw out the infection. Yet helping her further meant bringing her to the cabin, crossing a different kind of boundary, one far more significant than the river. Rose pointed toward her cabin, visible as a small dark shape against the tree line in the distance. Then she pointed to Kimmy's leg and mimicked wrapping a bandage. The question was clear. Would Kimmy trust her enough to come to her home for help? The girl's gaze followed Rose's pointing finger, then turned toward the opposite bank, toward her own home. Indecision and longing flashed across her face. She tried to stand but immediately sank back down, pain evident in her expression. Rose waited, patient, understanding the weight of the choice. Finally, Kimmy looked up and gave another small nod, acceptance in her dark eyes. With relief, Rose fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch, helping Kimmy to her feet. Together they began the slow journey back to the cabin, Rose supporting much of Kimmy's weight, their initial wariness giving way to a tentative partnership born of necessity. Neither girl could have known what this crossing of boundaries would mean, not just for themselves, but for the two worlds they represented. They couldn't have known that eyes had watched their meeting from the shadow of the trees on the far bank, or that word was already traveling back to the native encampment about the pale-skinned orphan girl who had carried the chief's daughter across the river. The cabin door creaked open as Rose helped Kimmy inside, guiding her to the single wooden chair by the hearth. Kimmy's eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, taking in the humble furnishings, the small table, the neatly made bed in the corner, the shelves stocked with preserved foods and dried herbs. Her body remained tense, ready to flee despite her injured leg. "You're safe here," Rose said softly, though she knew Kimmy wouldn't understand the words. It was the tone that mattered, the gentle hands that eased her into the chair. Rose stoked the fire and hung a pot of water to heat. From a wooden chest she retrieved clean cloths, a jar of honey, and bundles of dried herbs her mother had taught her to use for healing. Kimmy watched every movement, curiosity gradually replacing fear in her dark eyes. The leg wound looked worse in the cabin's light, deep and beginning to show the angry red lines of infection spreading outward. Rose worked methodically, first cleaning the gash with warm water, then grinding herbs into a poultice. Kimmy winced but made no sound as Rose applied the mixture and wrapped the leg with clean cloth. When the painful work was done, Rose offered a cup of water and a plate with bread and dried meat. Kimmy accepted eagerly, her hunger overcoming caution. As the girl ate, Rose noticed the intricate beadwork on her dress, the carefully crafted moccasins, and the small pouch hanging from a cord around her neck. Not the belongings of just any child from the tribe. Using gestures and simple drawings scratched onto a piece of bark, they began to communicate. Rose pointed to herself, then swept her arm around the cabin, indicating she lived alone. Kimmy nodded in understanding, then pointed to herself and across the river, drawing many small circles to show her people. Through this halting exchange, a story emerged. Kimmy had been collecting special plants along the riverbank when she slipped down a steep ravine, cutting her leg on sharp rocks. She'd been trying to get home when Rose found her. But there was something more, something Kimmy was trying to convey with increasing frustration at the language barrier between them. The girl touched the beaded designs on her dress, then made a gesture like placing something on her head. She sat up straighter, assuming a dignified pose. Rose frowned, not understanding, until Kimmy pointed to herself and made another gesture, a flat hand raised high, then pointing down at herself. "Your father," Rose guessed. "Is he important? A leader?" Kimmy seemed to catch her meaning and nodded vigorously, pointing to herself and then making the high gesture again. A chill ran down Rose's spine as understanding dawned. The intricate beadwork, the special pouch, the proud bearing even in pain. Kimmy wasn't just any girl from the tribe. She was the daughter of their chief. Rose sat back on her heels, the implications washing over her. She had brought the chief's daughter into her home, across the boundary that separated their peoples. Whatever goodwill she had earned by helping might be overshadowed by what could be seen as kidnapping by the tribe. Outside, the sun was already beginning its westward slide. Rose knew she needed to get Kimmy back to her people before nightfall, before search parties crossed the river looking for the chief's missing daughter. Yet Kimmy's leg needed rest, and the girl herself had fallen into an exhausted sleep in the chair, her head drooping against the wooden back. Rose moved quietly around the cabin, gathering supplies for the journey: water, Food, extra bandages, her father's hunting knife, and a walking stick to help Kimmy. She changed out of her own damp clothes and hung them by the fire to dry. As she worked, her mind raced with questions. Would the tribe welcome her as a helper or condemn her as an intruder? Would they understand she had acted out of kindness, not meddling? When Kimmy woke an hour later, her fever had broken and some color had returned to her cheeks. Rose helped her drink a tea brewed from willow bark for the pain, then explained through gestures that they needed to leave, to get Kimmy back to her people before dark. Understanding flickered in Kimmy's eyes, followed by something else, worry, perhaps even fear. She pointed to Rose, then across the river, and made a slashing motion across her throat. The warning was unmistakable. "They'll hurt me?" Rose asked, touching her own neck. Kimmy shook her head, then clarified with more gestures. They would be suspicious. Angry perhaps, but if Rose brought her directly to the village, shown by a circling motion of Kimmy's finger, she would speak for Rose, protect her. Rose nodded, gathering her courage. She had no choice. Kimmy needed to return home, and doing so openly was better than being discovered hiding the chief's daughter. Together they set out, Rose supporting Kimmy as they made their slow way back to the river and along its bank, heading upstream toward the place where the native village was rumored to be. The journey took longer than expected. Kimmy's strength, bolstered temporarily by food and rest, began to flag as they traveled. They stopped often, and Rose carried her across difficult terrain. As they walked, an unexpected bond formed between them. Smiles exchanged over a startled rabbit crossing their path, shared sips from Rose's water pouch, Kimmy teaching Rose the tribal word for river, for sky, for friend. By late afternoon, they had traveled far beyond where Rose had ever ventured. The forest grew denser, and she would have been lost without Kimmy's guidance. Then suddenly, the girl stiffened in Rose's arms. She made an urgent stopping motion, pointing ahead to where smoke from cooking fires rose above the trees. They had reached the edge of the native encampment. Rose hesitated, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to set Kimmy down and flee back to the safety of her cabin. But the girl's leg had begun bleeding again from the journey, and she couldn't leave her here alone. Before Rose could decide, shapes moved among the trees ahead. Tribal scouts who had spotted the strange pair. Words were called out in the native tongue, harsh and alarmed. More figures appeared, men with bows drawn, women pulling children behind them. Kimmy called out, her young voice carrying across the clearing. The response was immediate. Weapons lowered slightly, but suspicious eyes remained fixed on Rose. A path cleared as a tall woman with gray-streaked hair pushed through the gathering crowd. Her face was lined with authority and age. Her clothing marked with symbols Rose didn't understand but recognized as significant. The medicine woman, for that's what she appeared to be, approached them with measured steps. She looked Rose up and down, her gaze penetrating as if seeing beyond the surface to Rose's very thoughts. Then her attention turned to Kimmy, her eyes softening as she examined the bandaged leg. Kimmy spoke rapidly, gesturing to Rose and then to her leg, clearly explaining what had happened. The medicine woman listened without expression, then turned back to Rose. She spoke words Rose couldn't understand, but the tone was clear, not threatening but dismissive. A hand gesture pointed back the way they had come. The message needed no translation. Go now. Leave. Rose looked to Kimmy, reluctant to abandon her here without knowing she would be properly cared for. Kimmy reached out, squeezing Rose's hand briefly before letting go. Her eyes conveyed what words could not: gratitude, reassurance, and a silent promise. The medicine woman made the dismissive gesture again, more firmly. Behind her, the warriors still held their bows at the ready, their expressions making it clear that the tribe's patience with the pale stranger had limits. With a last look at Kimmy, now being examined by the medicine woman, Rose turned and began the long walk back to her cabin. She could feel the eyes of the tribe following her until she disappeared into the trees. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. The journey home seemed to take forever, the forest growing dark around her. By the time Rose reached her cabin, night had fallen completely. She barred the door behind her, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she felt, how exposed her small home was on the edge of the wilderness. What would the tribe think of her interference? Would they see it as the help of a kind stranger, or the meddling of an outsider who had crossed boundaries both physical and cultural. As she lay in her bed that night, too tired to eat but too anxious to sleep, Rose couldn't help wondering if she had done the right thing. The memory of Kimmy's grateful eyes reassured her, but the cold reception from the tribe left her uneasy. Something told her this encounter would have consequences beyond anything she could imagine. The night passed in fits and starts for Rose, her sleep broken by dreams of running through endless forests and wading across rivers that grew deeper with each step. When she finally fell into a heavy slumber near dawn, her body gave in to the exhaustion of the previous day's journey. A sound pulled her from the depths of sleep, so faint she nearly dismissed it as part of her dreams. Then it came again, the soft nickering of horses, not her own old mare who was safely in the small barn, but strange horses, many of them. Rose's eyes snapped open. The cabin was still dark, but a faint grayish light seeped through the cracks in the shutters. Dawn was just breaking. She lay perfectly still, listening. The sounds outside were subtle, the stamp of a hoof, the creak of leather, the almost imperceptible murmur of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Her mouth went dry. She slid from beneath her quilt, bare feet silent on the wooden floor as she crept to the window. With trembling fingers, she widened the crack in the shutters just enough to peer through. What she saw made her blood run cold. Standing in the clearing before her cabin, arranged in a perfect half-circle, were 30 warriors. Their faces were painted with ceremonial markings, feathers and beads adorning their hair, weapons visible but held at rest. They sat astride their horses or stood beside them with perfect stillness, as if they had been waiting there for hours and could wait for hours more. Rose pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. In the growing light, she could make out more details. The elaborate headdress worn by the central figure, the respectful distance maintained by the others, the way they were positioned to block any escape from the front of the cabin. These weren't just any warriors. This was an official delegation, led by someone of great importance. Had they come because of Kimmy? Had she unknowingly broken some tribal law by helping the girl? Rose's mind raced through the possibilities, each more frightening than the last. She backed away from the window and sank onto the edge of her bed, heart pounding. Her father's rifle stood in the corner, loaded as always, but what use would one gun be against 30 warriors? And using it would only confirm whatever suspicions had brought them here. Running was impossible. They had surrounded the front of the cabin, and even if she slipped out the back, they would catch her easily on horseback. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. Whatever fate they had brought with them to her doorstep, Rose realized she would have to face it. She splashed water on her face from the basin, smoothed her tangled hair, and quickly changed from her nightdress into her everyday clothes. If she was going to meet whatever waited outside, she would do it with dignity. Her parents had taught her that much. As she fastened the last button of her worn blue dress, a new thought struck her. If they had meant her immediate harm, wouldn't they have broken down the door already? They had arrived silently, forming up in the pre-dawn darkness, not attacking but waiting. Waiting, perhaps, for her to show herself. This realization didn't erase her fear, but it gave her a fragment of hope to cling to. Maybe, just maybe, this visit had a purpose beyond vengeance or punishment. Rose took a deep, steadying breath, whispered a quick prayer, and moved to the door. Her hand rested on the wooden bar that kept it secured. One more breath and she lifted it from its brackets and set it aside. The door swung open. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the clearing, illuminating the scene before her. In the growing light, the warriors looked even more imposing. Strong men with faces weathered by sun and wind, adorned with the markings of their status and achievements. Some held spears, others had bows across their backs, and all wore knives at their belts. For a long moment, no one moved. Rose stood in her doorway, heart hammering against her ribs, but her face carefully composed. She would not show them fear, whatever happened next. The silence broke when the central figure raised his hand. At the signal, the warriors parted, creating a path to her door. The leader urged his horse forward, stopping a respectful distance from where Rose stood. Now she could see him clearly. An older man with deep lines etched into his face, his bearing regal despite his age. He wore an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers, and his chest was covered with symbols of authority and power. Rose knew without being told that she was looking at Kimmy's father. The chief himself. Behind him rode another man, younger. whose clothing was simpler, but who carried himself with confidence. He guided his horse forward until he was beside the chief, then spoke. To Rose's shock, he addressed her in broken but understandable English. "The great chief, Thunder who walks, comes to the home of the pale girl who helped his daughter." Rose swallowed hard, finding her voice with effort. "I only did what anyone would do. She was hurt and needed help." The translator relayed her words. The chief listened, his expression unchanging, then spoke at length in his own language. His deep voice carried across the clearing, commanding attention. Rose couldn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her stand straighter. When he finished, the translator turned back to Rose. "The chief says many would not have helped. Many would have turned away, or worse. The river divides our lands, and few cross it with peaceful hearts." Rose nodded slowly. "I couldn't leave her there. She's just a girl like me." Again her words were translated, and again the chief responded, his dark eyes never leaving Rose's face. It was as if he was searching for something there. Truth, perhaps, or deception. "The chief's daughter told of your kindness," the translator continued. "How you carried her across the river, tended her wound, fed her from your stores though you have little yourself. How you brought her back to our people though you feared what might happen." Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected praise. Is the chief's daughter all right?" Her leg was badly cut. A flicker of surprise crossed the chief's face at her question, followed by what might have been the ghost of a smile. His reply was shorter this time. "She heals well. Our medicine woman says the herbs you used were good ones." "You know the plants of healing?" "My mother taught me before she died," Rose explained. "Both my parents are gone now." When this was translated, murmurs rippled through the gathering of warriors. The chief nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected. He spoke again at greater length, gesturing toward Rose, then to the warriors, then to the land around them. The translator listened carefully before turning back to Rose. "The chief says you are young to live alone in this place between worlds. You showed courage and a good heart when you helped his daughter. Such actions cannot go unnoticed or unrewarded." Rose shook her head quickly. "I don't need a reward. I only did what was right." Her words brought another murmur from the gathered warriors, this time with notes of approval. The chief raised his hand for silence, then reached behind him. From a decorated leather pouch, he withdrew something that caught the morning light, a small token hanging from a leather cord. He extended it toward Rose. The translator explained, "This is a special mark of the tribe. It shows you are under the protection of the chief and his people. Wear it and no harm will come to you from our warriors. Your cabin and lands will be respected as if they were the chief's own." Rose stepped forward hesitantly and accepted the gift. It was a small disc of polished stone, carved with symbols she didn't recognize but understood to be significant. The gesture overwhelmed her. After 2 years of facing the world alone, to suddenly have protection, acknowledgement, was almost too much to comprehend. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "Please tell the chief I'm honored." As the translator relayed her words, Rose slipped the cord over her head, letting the stone token rest against her chest. The chief nodded in approval, then spoke again, his tone now lighter, almost warm. "The chief invites you to visit his daughter when the sun has passed overhead 3 times. She wishes to see the one who helped her, to speak with you in a better way than before. Will you come?" The invitation surprised Rose as much as the token had. She glanced at the warriors, no longer threatening in her eyes, but simply men doing their duty to their leader. Then she looked back at the chief, seeing now not just authority but also the concern of a father for his child. "Yes," she said with growing confidence. "I will come." The chief seemed satisfied. He raised his hand in what appeared to be a blessing, spoke a few more words to his people, then turned his horse. With remarkable coordination, the warriors formed back into their lines. Just as silently as they had arrived, they began to move away from the cabin, heading back toward the river and their territories beyond.